Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back with our continuing Sunday school lesson. This is really a scholarly Bible series where we're looking at the Bible comprehensively and drawing on the years of scholarship that go into it to give us some part of the background. We're now in 1 Kings, part 2. We're going to pretty much wrap up 1 Kings. And this is a challenging uh, part of Kings to present. It's got some very interesting stuff at the end of this. It's got some very discouraging stuff at the beginning of what our assignment was. And what we were covering here was up until about chapter 12 through chapter 19. And this is with the death of Solomon and the rupture of the kingdom into two kingdoms, Israel, the northern kingdom, Judah, the southern kingdom. To restate the background, if you go back and look at the writings around David's kingdom, you'll see it's very personal. You got a lot of conversations in it, very detailed. That's because it clearly was drawn from David's court historian, a person who wrote these down at the time or shortly thereafter with the eyewitnesses. When you get into this part of Kings, you don't have that. You have history that's clearly written many centuries later, probably during the Babylonian exile. They make reference to various chronicles that have been lost in time, the chronicles of the kings of Judah and Israel and all that. And those, if they ever existed, we don't have them anymore. And so it's much more of a summary. So you don't have that personal feel until you get to certain parts of it, like the Elijah story later. So it's not as easy a reading. It's not as enjoyable as reading about King David because you got a very immediate history. Solomon dies in 931 BC, about. And you don't have the details of any intrigues as to why this one son succeeds him. If he had multiple wives and concubines, I'm certain he did, how this one son was able to acquire the throne or fend off his opponents. It's just not discussed. You have no idea. This is a gentleman named Rehoboam. He was about 40 or 41 at the time. And remember that in spite of all the good PR about Solomon, he had a huge administrative problem with his people, and that he was mandating forced labor. A force of about 30,000 people had to rotate to do basically slave labor for the king. A month of labor, 2 months off. The fourth month they had to come back and work for the king for a month, the 2 months off. And it would be the equivalent of taking millions and millions of Americans and making them do road work and stuff like that, because they were building palaces and temples and stuff like that. It'd be very, very unpopular if you or I were being conscripted to do manual labor for the government. Had no pay. And so when Rehoboam gets anointed, proclaimed king, the northern tribes want to have a meeting. And it's unclear from the account exactly when Jeroboam reappears. Jeroboam had been working for Solomon. He was the head of the forced labor program of brutalizing, and he was from the northern tribes, of brutalizing his northern tribes. So he actually revolted against Solomon, tried to overthrow him, separate the northern kingdom from the south, and he got beaten, and he fled and went to Egypt. Egypt was angry with the Jerusalem kingdom because they had historically, Egypt had ruled that part of Canaan, Palestine, whatever you want to call it. And they had been in decline for a couple hundred years. And so they were angry with the Israelites, the Hebrews, and they give this guy a sanctuary and let him stay there. He hears about Solomon's death, so he goes up and joins the tribe. They have a meeting at Shechem. It's very interesting that happens at Shechem. Shechem is the historical holy site of the tribal confederacy. If you remember, when Joshua was establishing the Hebrews in that land, he had a meeting at Shechem, which has been the old historical religious site even prior to the Hebrews. And they had the hero Israel, Lord your God is one God. It's a covenant renewal ceremony. It handed it to Joshua. Well, this is Shechem. And this is where they would have, when the tribes were still under a confederacy and they had a real problem, they would gather at Shechem to decide what to do, etc. This is the traditional meeting place. So they have a meeting here at this traditional meeting place. And the northern tribes asked Rehoboam, your father abused us and he was nasty and abusive. Are you going to do this to us? And Rehoboam says, time out, I want to parley, he'll come back in 3 days. But this time Jeroboam has arrived, and he's up there also. So Rehoboam goes back and meets with his counselors. It's unclear who these people are. And the elders of the group tell him, agree to it. Make a deal with the northern people. Give them what they want. If you give them what they want, they will love you. That's actually pretty good advice for a ruler. If you're nice to your people and take care of them, they're going to appreciate it. It's a foreign concept in the Middle East, but that's good advice to any ruler. But his buddies, the people he grew up with, probably his cousins and all the other rich hangers-on, and being a person of entitlement in a royal situation gives you a very warped appreciation of what reality is really like. They tell him, tell him you're going to be even nastier. Your father did this to him, and you're going to do it even harsher. And he's an idiot, let's put it very bluntly. So he tells them that, and they basically tell him to get lost. He tries to, and so they declare their own kingdom. They put Jeroboam on the throne, and a war starts. And they go at it back and forth. And at a point, it's unclear the details of all this. Rehoboam's able to fight him off for a while, and he sends a different person up to head up his forced labor program, and the northern tribesmen stone him to death. And they attack Rehoboam, and he's able to jump in his chariot and get away. So at this point, the northern tribes get together and crown Jeroboam, the former taskmaster of the slave labor program, declare him their king. And Rehoboam retreats back to Jerusalem. Jerusalem's a very good place to go to. It's high, it's difficult to attack, it's easy to defend, has water. And he stays there in the old kingdom of Judah. And that becomes known as the kingdom of Judah. It's the tribe of Judah, which is about 40% of the Hebrew population, and the tribe of Benjamin, which is really small, only 3 or 4 or 5%. And the northern 10 tribes become their own kingdom, which they call Israel. Jeroboam sets up his own capital at Shechem, and he fortifies it. He thinks, now, listen, I've got to have a rival temple to rival this temple that Solomon had built down in Jerusalem, or these people are going to go down there to worship, and they won't be loyal to this state. So he builds a temple at 2 traditional religious sites, at Bethel and at Dan. But what he does with these temples, they were probably relatively modest structures, probably made of wood, is he puts a golden calf in each one. Golden calf, remember, was the contamination during the Sinai when Moses came down off the mountain. And why is this the contamination? Because the golden calf is the symbol of Baal, the fertility god. And this is part of what I've called the 700-year war between the Yahweh faith and the Baal corrupt fertility rites. And the problem this kingdom had is the fertility worship is all around them. It's around them to the west, northwest in Lebanon, up in Syria to the north, over in Jordan to the northeast, all around them. It's very corruptive, and it's an easy faith because it glories in sexuality. They have sacred prostitutes. They don't really demand much of you other than some ritual and a lot of sexual activity, which is not a problem to most people. But it doesn't have the rigid series of laws and obediences and demands that the Yahweh faith has then, and differently, but still demands now. So it's a tough competition in this war. It goes on for centuries, and basically looks like Jeroboam just surrenders to it. Yeah, you can have your Yahweh faith if you want, but I'm going to allow people to have the Baal faith also. You blend it all together and you end up with nothing. So he builds these two temples. The sacred golden calves are in each. To me, this is an utter abomination. But again, down in Solomon's temple, he had these 2 winged creatures in the Holy of Holies, which to me is an abomination of these graven images in where you worship. That violates the commandment. So anyway, he gets a bad press in the Hebrew text, and so a variety of things happen. You have intermittent war between the 2 kingdoms. They go at each other, and it's kind of a situation where nobody can really win. Neither side is strong enough to win the other. This happens in some wars. even in our own time. You've looked at the struggle in Northern Ireland. The Protestants, the Catholics went at each other for about 30 years. There was no military solution. Neither side could win. You couldn't make the other side go away. You couldn't kill them all off. And so they finally had to make a deal. So some wars are not winnable. Sometimes neither side's strong enough to win. So that's what happened with them. But the problem happens for the Southern Kingdom is Egypt suddenly comes back to life. Now, I've always said that God kept Egypt down while David and Saul and Solomon had their prosperous kingdoms. It's kind of like God's punishing the Southern Kingdom now by letting the Egyptians come back to life as an empire. A new Pharaoh comes over named Shishak, and he comes up conquering along the way. There's very limited detail, but essentially he takes all the gold from the temple and the palace, demands it all. They give it to him as a bribe a tribute is probably a better term. Yes, we won't destroy you, but give us all your gold. And so they do that and give it all. He takes it back to Egypt. They have to substitute bronze for the symbols that they had that used to be golden symbols in the palace and the temple. This is a real humiliation. You can read it as divine punishment for their failure in managing the faith and keeping the Northern Kingdom and also keeping the corruptions out of the temple in the Southern Kingdom, because the corruptions were there also. It's a very interesting question. So both kingdoms are corrupted by the Baal faith. It's a struggle with these cults. When you get into the Northern Kingdom, you have a series of really difficult monarchs. Jeroboam's family, after he dies, they get thrown out and they get butchered, is the term that my translation uses, by someone else takes over and puts his family in charge. And after a generation or two, or maybe his whole family gets butchered and someone else takes over. And then someone else takes over and butchers everybody. It's really a blood feast. One guy lasts 7 days as the king of the Northern Kingdom. Finally, a guy named Omri comes along, and he doesn't get a good press in the scriptures because he's very much a corrupter and encourages the Baal faith. But he's able to hold on for 20-some years and stabilize the Northern Kingdom. Like I said, we have the intermittent fights between the two kingdoms. Neither of them strong enough to beat each other. And Omri is able to make the kingdom at least somewhat stable. And he said he lasts 22 years. Now, his son is Ahab. And Ahab had been married before he becomes king to Jezebel. And it's interesting how these two names have emerged in our modern language to have its own meaning. If you call a woman a Jezebel, then she's designed to be a seductive, manipulative, nasty, selfish, aggressive person. If you call somebody Ahab, as Herman Melville did in Moby Dick, that you imply the person's basically crazy, evil and crazy together, because Captain Ahab was the captain in Moby Dick, if you remember, trying obsessed with killing the white whale. So Ahab becomes king, and his wife is Jezebel, and she's a princess from the Lebanon area, from the Tyre area. She's a fanatical supporter of the Baal Ashtart fertility cults, and she wants to force this on the Hebrew people in the north, and she would do it in the south if she could get away with it. And she's very, very aggressive, and she starts to murder off the followers of the Yahweh faith. It's different than a lot of the kings. If you want to follow Yahweh, okay. If you want to follow Baal, okay. This changes it, where I'm going to try to stamp out the Yahweh faith and force the Baal faith on you. So they put up the sacred poles, and they put the idols in the temple and all this, build temples to Baal. This is a huge, huge problem, and it's a real challenge. And so God calls a person who comes from nowhere, from Tishba, and he's just a person off the street named Elijah, and he becomes really known as the great prophet of the Hebrew people. He gets this call, and he doesn't know exactly what to do, but he understands he's beginning to have miraculous powers, so he is able to work a couple of miracles, take some grain and some oil and make it just by magic, almost by supernatural powers, turn it into bread, a regular meal, that the person he was staying with, her her young son dies, and he's able to raise him from the dead. And so he realizes that he's got divine charge and divine power. And so he goes to Ahab and he challenges him. Let's have a contest. I'll take on the priests of Baal. We'll see, and I'll represent the Lord Yahweh, and we'll see who wins. It's an interesting concept. And Ahab says, okay. Because it's interesting, the scholarly text I've used for some of this really is down on Jezebel. She's terrible, and which she is. I'm not, but he doesn't blame Ahab for anything. I thought, wait a minute, this guy is the king, and it's a very chauvinistic society. He could control this woman if he chose to. So, they're both equally guilty here. You got evil men and evil women. Evil's not one gender or the other, and it's not particularly worse in a female than it can be. People can be worse, but let's put them both together because they're both guilty as can be in this. So Elijah challenges them. So they get about 400 of the prophets of Baal, and each of them get an oxen, and they can sacrifice the oxen and chop it up to prepare their sacrifice. And they each dig a fire pit. And so the priests of Baal dig the fire pit, and the challenge is to have your God start the fire and consume this sacrifice. So they prance around and they take their swords and slash themselves, and they dance and whirl and all this for hours and hours, and nothing happens. No surprise there, right? Nothing's going to happen. Baal doesn't exist, and he's not going to be able to do anything. So nothing happens. And Elijah's there making fun of him. Maybe he's asleep. Maybe he took a trip. Maybe he's preoccupied, which really probably translated, maybe he's going to the bathroom. And he's taunting them. And finally this goes on for hours, and finally they give up. So Elijah goes over and gets water and pours it on the wood that he set up in this fire pit. And he does that 3 times, so there's water around it in the fire pit, and then there's the wood, and then there's the dismembered oxen thing. And he calls down, and God strikes it with fire. That's all we have, the description. We don't really know exactly what that was. It sounds like a lightning bolt to me. And it hits, boom, and the whole thing is consumed. And everybody goes, oh! And Elijah gets all the followers to kill all the priests of Baal. And slaughters all of them. There's a lot of butchering in this part of the Bible. It's a tough read for someone like me who doesn't really like to see people butchered. And so they have this celebration. Well, somehow this makes Jezebel angry. No surprise there, is it? So she decides she's going to have Elijah killed. Again, no real surprise here. So he thinks, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. I got to get out of here. So he flees down into the southern kingdom, goes down through the southern kingdom to Beersheba. Now, if you're a little bit of the geography, there's Jerusalem in the middle of what's the kingdom of Judah. South of there, about 30 miles, and south of another 30 miles is Beersheba. And so about 40 to 50 miles south of Jerusalem. This is the edge of the desert. Beersheba is the last water supply before you get into the Negev. And so he's there in Beersheba, and the angel comes to him and says, you need to go to Mount Horeb. Now, remember that the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom had 2 different names for the sacred mountain where Moses had gone up on the mountain and gotten the 10 Commandments. Sinai is the name to the southern kingdom of Judah. Horeb is the name to the northern kingdom, now Israel, as the kingdom of Israel. And so he goes, oh, okay. He has this long journey. It says 40 days and 40 nights. I don't know how long it would take to walk from Beersheba down into the Sinai, but that 40 days seems about right. And so he's there on the mountain, and he's resting inside. It's either a cave or a cleft. It's not clear. And depending on how you want to translate the words. And this is very similar to Moses. If you remember back when Moses went up to the mountain a different time to meet God, Moses was in the cave or the cleft in the rock, and he was able to see God's back. So this is what you're going to have here is a completely different description, because in the Moses era, God was in the storm, God was in the lightning, God was in the fire. This represented the powerful deity on the mountain. So Elijah's there, kind of huddled down in this cleft in the rock or cave, whichever one you want to call it. And first there's the hurricane, and God was not in the hurricane. Okay. Then there was an earthquake, and God was not in the earthquake. And then there was fire, and God was not in the fire. This is showing a different appreciation of God, and the appreciation of God changes throughout the Old Testament. Till you get to Isaiah, you have a completely different appreciation of God in the latter part of Isaiah. We'll do that in this class. But then there is a soft murmuring voice, and God was in the soft voice. A light murmuring sound is what it says in my translation, and that indicates God's presence. So Elijah comes out, doesn't have a face-to-face meeting with God, but a contact with God. God tells him to return to Israel. You've got several tasks ahead of you. You are to make Hazael king of Aram. Aram is the area in Syria to the north around Damascus. Okay, it's interesting that this Hebrew goes and identifies a new king of Syria. You are to proclaim Jehu as a different person as king of Israel, replacing Ahab and Jezebel. It doesn't happen immediately, but happens eventually. And you appoint a man named Elisha, Elisha, as a prophet to succeed you. And then God will strike and kill all the Baal followers in Israel. And that's where we stop. So it's interesting. It goes through this very grim account of all these people slaughtering everyone for the name of political power. And then it ends up with the Lord triumphant and in control when he chooses to be, which is using Elijah to defeat the priests of Baal and to restore the faith and keep it alive, not to bring it back to dominance, but keep it alive. Because a lot of this struggle with the Baal 700-year war with the Baals is to keep the Yahweh faith alive in the presence of all these popular and easy and non-demanding Canaanite religions. And then so Elijah is able to do this. One person chosen from nowhere to keep the faith alive and emerge triumphant in this. So we're going to stop here. The reading for the next time is 1 Kings chapters 20, 21, and 22. Then into 2 Kings chapters 1 through 8. That's a historical reading that we'll get to, which will take us really to the destruction of the northern kingdom. After that, we're actually going to do a couple prophets. So the couple prophets from the prophet list who are pure northern kingdom prophets, Amos and Hosea. Amos is my favorite prophet, other than Isaiah, which we'll do. Isaiah is the southern kingdom prophet. So as we get to the end of the northern kingdom, we'll start picking the prophets up one by one, and we'll go back and forth between the historical text and the prophet text. Amos is an excellent prophet. He was the one that was quoted by William Jennings Bryan when he ran for president 3 times. Actually, he was a friend of my great-grandfather's, and talked about the impressing people with the crown of gold, et cetera, et cetera. So it'll be very interesting when we get there in 2 weeks. So this is Dr. Guthrie. Thank you very much.